The Masque of Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the past ban which shut him out from the aid and the sympathy of his fellow men, and the whole seizure, process and termination of the disease were the incident of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominus were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the steep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall grided in it. The wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furniture and messy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither to ingress or egress, to the sudden impulses, or despair or the frenzies from within. The abbey was applied provisions, with such precaution to the courtiers might bid defiance to caution. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve, or to think. The prince had provided all the applicants of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatory, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security within. Without was the Red Death. It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furious aboard, the Prince Prospero entertained his thousands of friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. The voluptuous scene, the masquerade. But first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many places, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregular, disposed the division embraced, but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect, to the right and left, in the middle of each wall. A tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon the closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were the stained glass, whose colour varied, in accordance with the prevalent hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the paints were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished with light and orange. The fifth was white. The sixth was violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in the chambers only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The paints here were scarlet, a deep blood color. No in one. Now, in one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or cherubim amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered at the fruit or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emitting from a lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed suit, there stood, opposing to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that protected its rays through the tinted glass, and so glaring illuminated the room, and thus reproduced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight has streamed upon the dark hangings, through the blood-tainted panes, was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the courtiers of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment, also, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to the through with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made a circuit of the face and the hour was to be striken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud, and deep and extremely musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause, momentarily, in a performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltz's performance ceased the evolutions. And there was the brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and, while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in a confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, and light laughter at once pervaded at assembly, the musicians looked at another, and smiled, as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows to each other that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds with a time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcern and tremulousness and meditation as before. But, in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes and the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colour and effects. He disregarded the decorum of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery. His conceptions glowed with barbaric lustre. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed, in great part, the movable establishments of the 7 chambers, upon occasion of the great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. But sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter, and pipsqueak and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were brusque figures, and unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these the dreams withered in and about, taking use of the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as an echo of the steps, and, anon, the strikes of the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, and the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured by an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells and the dream live, and with her do the throw more merrily than ever, taking you from the many-tinted windows through which stream of rays from the tripods. But the chamber which lies most westwardly to the Severn, there are now none of the Masques who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes in the blackness of the stable drapier pause, and to him whose foot falls upon the stable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more somnolently empathetic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of another apartment. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat furiously the heart of life, and the revel went ringingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of the midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have thought at the evolutions of the waltzes were quieted, and there was the uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clocks, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept, and more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled, and thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of his new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then, finally, of terror, of horror, and of disgust, in an assembly of phantom mist, such as I painted. It may well be supposed that no ordinary appearances could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had an out-holdered herald, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's identified decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless, which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the otherless lost, to whom life and death are equally just. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the consume and bearing of the stranger neither wit or prosperity existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have difficulty in detecting the cheat, and yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the madrivals around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his brow bone, with all the features of his face, was besprinkled with a scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon the spectral image, which, with a slow solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to the throne among the waltzes. He was seen to convulse, in the first moment which strong shudder, either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us at the blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was at Easton, or the Blue Chamber, in which stood the Prince Prospero. As he uttered these words, they rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, and a group of pale courtiers at his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of the group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker, but from a certain nameless awe, with which the mad assumption of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who were forthhand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within the yard of the prince's person, and, while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centres of the room to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had disguised him for the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, though yet again to the white, and thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had made him to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on count of the death terror that seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure. Then a ladder, having attained extremely of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleamingly onto the stable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death of the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, the throng of the revels at once threw themselves onto the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose stout figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which handled with so violent and rudeness, and attended by the tangible form, and now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revels in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the departing posture of his fall, and the life of the ebony clock went out with that last of the gay, and the flames of the tripod expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable demotion over all. The end.